All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Welcome to From Tall Ships to Blue Highways, honoring America's past, navigating New York's future. My name is Aria Cochran, and I am the Director of Communications here at Waterfront Alliance. In case you don't already know, the Waterfront Alliance is a US-based nonprofit with a network of more than 1,100 partners committed to advancing environmental resilience, economic opportunity, and equitable access across shorelines, waterfronts, and coastlines in the New York, New Jersey region and beyond. We work to drive real change by bringing together communities, policymakers, and industry leaders to shape a more resilient and climate-ready future for our waterways. We're especially excited to gather in this moment in time. As the country starts looking ahead to America's 250th anniversary, Sail 250's historic convening of tall ships happening this week, very exciting, New York has a unique opportunity to both reflect on its maritime past and reimagine its future. Today's webinar, we'll say the title one more time, From Tall Ships to Blue Highways, Honoring America's Past, Navigating New York's Future, explores how the city's working waterfront, once the backbone of commerce, immigration, and cultural exchange, can now again play a central role in shaping a resilient and dynamic urban future. Through today's discussion, we'll look at how initiatives like the New York City Blue Highways Program can build on that legacy, offering innovative ways to move people and goods across our waterways, reducing congestion, strengthening supply chains, supporting local jobs, and reconnecting communities to the water. It is my honor to introduce to you our panelists today. First, we have Paul Lipson. Paul is the co-principal of Barretto Bay Consulting, an urban solutions consulting firm specializing in place-based economic development, clean transportation, waterborne freight, and community engagement. Jonathan Boulware is president of the South Street Seaport Museum, leading efforts to preserve and interpret New York City's maritime history. Max Taffet is the senior vice president, Ports, Waterfront, and Transportation Asset Management at New York City Economic Development Council, advancing economic development initiatives with a focus on waterfront planning and infrastructure. Brad Vogel serves as a Blue Highways integration advisor to Hudson Shipping Company. He previously served as supercargo for Schooner Apollonia, overseeing regional cargo operations and developing logistics networks from 2020 to 2024 for a sail freight venture employing cargo bikes and electric vehicles for first and last mile service. Iliamia Dennis is a president of the U.S. Coastal Service, a company developing zero-emission maritime freight solutions for New York Harbor. Her background spans finance, logistics, ESG strategy, and blue economy research. And finally, last but not least, Leslie Vasquez is leader to the Point Community Development Corporation, advancing environmental justice, community development, and climate resilience initiatives in the South Bronx. We are grateful to have a knowledgeable group of experts in transportation, climate planning, and maritime innovation joining us today for this webinar. So let's get started. I'd love to open with a broad question for the whole group. New York City's waterways helped build the city and the nation at large. As we look toward the future, what role do you see the waterfront playing in the next era of urban resilience and mobility? Maybe start with Leslie and then kind of go down from there.
Sure, thank you, and hi everybody. I want us all to start thinking about how our waterfronts were planned for. Most of our waterfronts in New York City are industrial, and that was done intentionally. We used to rely on water freight and on water for transportation services. But as that aged out and we started using trucks and vehicles to start getting things on roads, we shifted from that kind of industry. And we shifted in a negative way, in the sense that trucks bring congestion, air pollution, poor public health. It creates a lot of inaccessibility to residents. And that's how a lot of our waterfronts are sited today. So when we think about an industrial zoning and we think about our waterfronts, they're interconnected with each other. And we stopped thinking about our water as a form of mobility and as a form of transportation and as a form of trade. And so if we activate the waterfront spaces so that they could be that again, we can make them into working waterfronts for the sake of transportation. But it's not just for goods, it could also be for people. And this is where waterfronts could be activated at its full capacity. We could have people get on boats. We could have tours. We could have transportation of workers that are going to be on those boats. But we could also activate the water by having young people on canoes and by having do billion oyster projects around waterfronts. And that's something that is not utilized today because of the lack of inaccessibility that we have and because of the fact that we've reimagined waterfronts to be industrial for roads and trucks and goods, but waterfront spaces could be so much more. And it needs to be useful for people. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's great. All right, rest of the panel. Anybody else want to jump in? Maybe Alana next?
Sure, hi, everybody. Um, so the city was, as Leslie mentioned, built around water, and a lot of our waterfront is industrial, and that was by design. But I think oftentimes, even growing up in this area, you're not really exposed to what goes on in the waterfront. And a lot of the uses that have been the waterfront has been allocated today have often been for passive uses, so beautiful parks, greenways, walkways, and otherwise. Um, and so I think for my purposes, maybe selfishly, I think the waterfront has to be thought of as an active, part of the infrastructure system today again. So what does that look like? For me, it's Blue Highways, utilizing the waterfront to move goods again. So there was a time where every end of a street ended in a pier, right? We're not trying to, we're probably not able to bring that back, but we need to sort of take what's old and make it new. Um, and start moving goods in a way that creates redundancy and resiliency for New York City. So I don't think Blue Highways, I'm not going to espouse that it's the answer for moving all goods in New York City, but it is the answer to moving a lot of things. And what does that mean for waterfront and waterfront communities? That means shifting some truck traffic off the roads in meaningful ways, reducing burdens on the roadways, air, and otherwise. And then in terms of redundancy when events such as Sail 250, FIFA World Cup come into town, there are impacts to congestion, road closures, delivery restrictions, right? You're creating an alternative or sort of complementary network of transportation that has sort of disappeared, but we want to bring that back. So we've been working on demonstrating that in the harbor and hopefully um, sort of this is a very timely conversation, as we've said, because there's so much going on that sort of expedites that sort of attention on Blue Highways as a viable means of moving goods throughout the city.
Definitely. That absolutely. I think we all can agree on that here. Jonathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for great tee-ups there. This is a conversation that's already emerging here. I guess I want to put a little more substance on the kind of history, how we got here, because I think as we think about an asset, right, that is the water's edge of New York City and the public realm that is the harbor and the waterfront, it does matter how we got here. And it is totally correct that it was developed as port infrastructure, but not in a master planned kind of way. I mean, we're talking about a Lenape settlement that became Dutch New Amsterdam as an outpost of the Dutch West India Company that then was taken over by the British. And then apropos of the moment that's about to emerge in 5 days in 1776, the United States sort of was formed around the concept of the Declaration of Independence. But what was happening in New York here very locally, which was the epicenter of all of what we're about to commemorate with America 250, was a harbor that was built was based on geographical advantage, a deep water harbor with access up the North River to inland. And yes, the Erie Canal would later make that this place from, a sort of rising star to absolute juggernaut. But it wasn't deliberate planning, right? And from even in the early United States, even over here on the East River, which is one of the last sort of surviving pieces of that infrastructure in the form of piers and warehouses, these piers were largely privately owned. They were owned by shipping companies. So even here at the museum, Pier 16 was the Cuba Mail Line. That was an independent company. The first innovation here on shipping, the Blackball Line, first ship to leave on a schedule, left just uptown from here at Peck Slip. And then as you sort of march through the decades and centuries of this, you have New York that emerged as a major metropolitan seaport city, the first global city in the world, I would argue, on the basis that we were connecting to the rest of the world via this port infrastructure through migration of people and commerce and so on. And at that point, we find this sort of peak where the New York City administration included a Department of Ports and Terminals and a Department of Docks, commissioner level jobs that oversaw the major infrastructure that was, whether privately owned or publicly owned, an infrastructure that served the core activity that was New York City at the time. And this, a few short steps, both rhetorically and practically, from South Street to Wall Street and the financial capital of the world. And without kind of going too far into our mission in New York City history, what I'm trying to illuminate here is what started actually as something that was fairly opportunistic. Water's really deep here. We can take advantage of this spot, that turned into something much more planful. But in my view, what has happened in the atrophy of the port infrastructure of Manhattan, and indeed at some level of New York generally, the port of New York and New Jersey, right, which then is a major port if we include New Jersey, but if it's just the port of New York, that's largely atrophied. And what happened in that was a loss of focus, whether it's from mayoral or gubernatorial administrations, or certainly from a city planning standpoint. And so this was a set of infrastructural pieces, wooden piers and so forth, that were allowed to lie fallow and ultimately to degrade and collapse into the river and so on. And what I guess I want to say is there's a notion that we talk about a lot in this sort of return to the waterfront that I think is a little bit simplistic and a little romantic. The idea that New Yorkers are going to find their way back to their waterfront. But I mean, even when I first started coming to town here, there was a sort of a disconnection in what was much like the western parts of Houston Street was like a post-industrial urban slum. So this wasn't like we used to all be in happy unity with our waterfront. These piers were walled off. There were Pinkerton guards at the faces of them, stopping people who didn't have business there from getting there. This was commercial maritime infrastructure. So if we're talking about, access for people and making this about people, we're talking about a new phase. This is not a return to something that has existed before. And so what I would just introduce and kind of wrapping up this comment is to say that if we're going to think about this, it needs to be with a new pair of glasses. And if we're going to think about the water edge of New York City as a public asset to be considered for the public good, then absolutely yes, like green shipping. And I'm cautious about using Blue Highway because it's just shipping. It's been happening all along and it's cool branding. But ultimately, what we're talking about is using the water, which is the simple, cheapest, and most environmentally sustainable way of moving things around, goods or people. And so we need to think about this from the standpoint of these activities and how they get along with each other, how you put what is in effect a commercial operation alongside ferry services or parks, and we should have all of those things. And then finally, and this is the real killer, is that we have to think about this from the standpoint of what is the time scale for some of these things and how that relates to sea level rise. In the early part of the environmental movement, there was a reduce, reuse, recycle, and all anyone ever did was recycle. Nobody did any reducing or reusing. And I see the same thing emerging in this resiliency thing, is like we're building with concrete and rebar, but no one's talking about retreat. Retreat is the reduce and reuse of resiliency planning, and it's not on the table much of anywhere. And so as we think about the river's edge of the city, or the water's edge of the city, I think all of these things will have to be in the mix for us to be an effective urban planning for the good and wellness of the citizens of New York.
Good, Brad.
Yes, thanks so much. No, I really appreciate what Jonathan just had to say and wanted to, in some ways, double down and expand on this notion that after the great atrophy in the mid 20th century of our working waterfront, that we really have arrived at this different moment with the different lenses he mentioned. I found that when I was working with Schooner Apollonia, a smaller scale, sustainable shipping venture, but it was one that could actually operate in different places and in a more integrated, multivariate way along the waterfront. So you could dock in places and still have engagement with the general public because you're working at that particular scale. Um, and I think that's going to be more important than ever as more and more of the waterfront in the core of New York City's waterfront zone becomes parkland. I mean, that is the trend. And even as resilience happens, it's usually resilience in tandem with park at the water's edge. what that water's edge actually consists of, I think, is the critical thing that we can influence, which is, okay, so you're going to have a park, but you can make that a multivariate waterfront, one that makes it possible in some places to also have vessels dock, have the basic infrastructure that allows for vessels to come up alongside, and to have small scale integration with cargo bikes and trailers and things like that that can actually knit in some of the blue highways and traditional work. Um, but yeah, I think scale is also important when we talk about where does blue highways around New York Harbor go from here. I think a lot of the efforts are focused, even the word highway. I think we also, metaphorically speaking, need to have blue streets and blue lanes before we get to the highways. To use a different metaphor, we need weeds and shrubs and trees to have an overall healthy ecosystem. And I think to go back to the one of the themes, what does history tell us from before the fall, so to speak? I think it says that we need a robust, multi-partite, like wide-ranging array of parties operating at the water's edge. So that's from very small scale, one-person shops that are doing one specific part of the work, where there's ways for collaboration, there's incubation of small scale water dependent industries that then can scale and grow and collaborate and build out a healthy, robust waterfront. I think that's something we're missing right now. A lot of the focus is up at the very high end level, but we need to have places for experimentation. We need to have ways for small scale operators to get in the game, innovate, and grow. And that's something I'm really looking forward to being part of.
Very cool. We've talked a lot about the history. Max, looks like you're ready to talk about the future and what we're starting to regain on these waterfronts.
Absolutely. And I mean, some of this is live and happening as we speak, but I think going from what Jonathan sort of framed up with the Pinkerton privatized waterfront, moving towards sort of I think the last 20, 30 years since the first Department of City Planning waterfront plan in the early 90s. We've gone from a sealed off water's edge, then to setting out goals of bringing people back to the water's edge, and kind of in the Euclidean planning mindset of we will have this here, this here, this here. We have we've made huge amounts of progress on greenways around the waterfront, but that has come with challenges in terms of small businesses being able to find a location to be able to get across that water's edge. The challenge as we go forward is integration, and I think there's a lot of things that kind of out of sight, out of mind have been taking place over the last 20 years or so. And I think some really good examples are the Department of Sanitation's cross harbor and marine transfer stations, where we now have containerized garbage going into barges and moving across New York Harbor in order to get on rail lines, thereby avoiding thousands and thousands of vehicle miles traveled. And there's been a real awakening about even the question of how do we avoid the trucks getting to those waterfront spaces, not driving across half of the city in order to have that, from a equity of different parts of the city being able to directly manage their waste services, be that on a DEP front, or be it on a consumer garbage, or even be it on a electricity and clean energy front. But moving into this direction that I think a lot of my fellow panelists are sort of mentioning is how do we begin to embrace sort of this flexible waterfront edge where multiple different stakeholder interests, needs are coming together, that sort of creating situations that are able to be financially supported. As we've come to learn, waterfront in New York City, waterfront period, is extremely expensive when it comes to the investments. And we're accustomed in New York City to having spaces that can do more than one thing at a time. We're beginning to see these sort of mixed use operations. And I think a really good example that I turn folks' attention to is the Stapleton and North Shore waterfront. That's where we've got industrial facilities, we've got DOT, Staten Island ferry operations, and we've got a bounty of new esplanades and housing coming online. And so I think that's really a direction that can be an inspiration as we talk about how we sort of stitch all these things together going forward.
Salient points. Paul, I would love to hear from you.
Oh, listen, everybody said all the things I would have said much better than I would have said them. But I will say that one neighborhood, one zip code that Leslie and I know well, which is the South Bronx, the Hunts Point section of the Bronx, is what's known as a significant maritime industrial neighborhood. We don't have a heck of a lot of maritime, with a handful of exceptions. And the other word there is industrial. And why is that important? Because when we did have a network of ports over every linear foot of our waterfront, they were deeply connected to industrial infrastructure, light manufacturing, heavy manufacturing in M3 zones. What it meant was that if you were building something, making something, fabricating, processing something that couldn't fit on a wagon or wasn't appropriate for railroad, you bring it in by barge or freighter or schooner, depending on the era. And so that's why we also had a lot of manufacturing at the port or just inland. And that network of port to manufacturer to shipper or terrestrial shipper or sometimes waterborne freight supported thousands of what we might now call living wage, blue collar jobs in New York City. And I think you could probably trace the decline of ports to and track it with the decline of manufacturing in these significant maritime industrial neighborhoods. Now, on the upside, when you look at a place like South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, where you've restored the port, you have enough upland space to restore the industrial jobs. And why do you need that? You need it because the scale of components, the scale of raw materials you need to build offshore wind, which is what SBMT has been repurposed for, is so great that you can't put it on a truck. It's not going to go across the GWB. It's not going to go through a tunnel. So in the future, a future that I look forward to, if we had sufficient upland connected to sufficient port space, we could find a way to restore a portion of those industrial jobs in targeted industries that make sense. And that's why I'm excited about this, not just for the basic environmental justice and equity implications and the decongestion, but potentially for the overall job creation and the bigger value chain of this.
No, I think that's really relevant. And I know on our prep questions, we were going to kind of jump to the Blue Highways, but I'd love to hear from Leslie here about Hunts Point and the impact of the maritime and shipping industry down in the South Bronx.
Yeah, Paul laid it out well, but Hunts Point is one of the largest food distribution centers in the world, which also means we have a lot of industry, a lot of truck traffic, and a lot of congestion in our area. And Hunts Point was designed to provide for the entire New York City. However, the residents of Hunts Point don't receive much of that. We have a lot of trucks, a lot of things happening to us, and trucks coming through us. But the fact that we have such a heavy reliance and dependence on roads and trucks causes us to have one of the worst asthma rates in the entire country. And so, from an environmental justice and resiliency perspective, we want to shift from that so that we could have better public health for our people in the Bronx and all over New York City. We didn't think about the ferries as a way of transportation from the EDC back when it was first released. But look at how great they are. Everybody wants to ride them, they're fun. It's a way that you could see sights, and people want more routes. They want to use the ferries. And Hunts Point is a perfect location to create another port for water freight and water usage. And we see the port in Hunts Point as an example of what other ports around New York City could do. because a comment that was said earlier is that we don't have a system for the transit and transportation that we have. And if we are able to create a system of ports, of water freight, of ferries that ship goods, people, and has activation of things, we can create a plan for New York City to shift from trucks to a better mode of transportation. Um, and it's not just about having those ports on our waterfront for the sake of goods and for the sake of water freight. It's also about the access that we're creating for the people that are living in the neighborhoods. Because these industrial sites are on the waterfront and there's so much trucks, they're on the sidewalk, it's very congested and not appealing. People don't get to the waterfront. People don't even know that the waterfront exists within a walking distance from their homes. When we're talking about creating a system, especially in Hunts Point, we can't just think about creating a port and just leaving it at that. We need to think about the transportation access. How are people getting there? Yes, there are parks, but people don't use those parks because they can't get to them. So when we think about reactivating the waterfront and having something that is active, we also want to think about doing it more strategically in a planned manner with a system that works so that people can use that as a form of transit in the same way that we have the New York City ferries. They work. People like them. Can we give Blue Highways a try? Can we give activating the waterfront in Hunts Point a try? Um, and yeah, there's many benefits to that. But that last mile component of having the trucks deliver things on the last mile of their trips can also be reimagined. We don't need trucks to transport those goods within a mile of a distance. We could have electric cargo trikes. We could have different modes of transportations that are electric that aren't truck heavy or truck reliant. And that's what we want to see in Hunts Point. We want to have a completely reimagined way of how we view transportation and trade and transit. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity in Hunts Point. It just needs to be activated.
I love that. And you use the keyword, the marketing term for shipping Blue Highways. As Jonathan made that joke earlier. Alana, I'm not sure if you're still on, but if you are, I'd love to hear from you and some of the work that you're doing with Blue Highways.
Yes, sorry, my internet is terrible, so I turned off my camera to make sure I'm preserving some of my bandwidth. Yes, would love to speak about that. So, uh, for a bit of background, U.S. Coastal, we are a vessel operator, but we also consider ourselves a logistic partner. We're focused on operationalizing Blue Highways, and so as I think Jonathan and Leslie pointed out, that's sort of the branding of our marine highways local to New York Harbor. So what does that mean? What makes this transformative is not really moving goods by water, right? That happens today and then happened historically. What has shifted is the focus on the types of goods that are being moved, so the nature of the cargo, and then connecting that movement to the land side. So connecting the maritime freight to the sort of urban landside logistics, which could look like micro hubs, cargo bikes, bike lanes, clean delivery vehicles. And then what does that look like in terms of neighborhood distribution throughout the city? It also is transformative because we're forced to think outside silos. I think oftentimes maritime, you're focused on maritime, right? But in order to make the city's blue highways happen, we have to think across these silos. So not just marine operations, but also the marine infrastructure, our streets, our curbs, the land use, the types of vehicles we're connecting with, the workforce development, and then partnering with the private sector to, sort of hold their hands and help them make that transition. So one thing we're particularly proud of is trying to make this practical for the private sector. And what that looks like today is having a vessel that is a secondhand vessel. It is a mid-size roll-on, roll-off capable vessel that can move a mix of cargo formats. And why that's important is we don't know what that perfect formula is today, those perfect goods, what they are today, right? So we need to experiment a little bit and take a little bit of risk. And so we're able to move pallets, we're able to move micro freight, cargo bikes, technically vans, box trucks, containers, and trailers. So we're not just sailing from point A to point B, right? We're taking that sailing, but then we're figuring out the handoff on sort of the front end and the back end. how is that cargo handed off to us? How is it staged? How is it received at the landing point? And then integrated into that local delivery network. Because if any of that is clunky, this isn't going to be an attractive solution to the private sector. And we're competing against a very attractive solution, which for private sector, which is trucking. It's very easy. There is a public system already. There's the highways and roadways network. So there's not much thinking that has to go into that, right? We need the equivalent on the waterfront. So we need to think about what is a full, robust network that is thoughtfully designed for the purposes of Blue Highways going to look like. So we have sort of that maritime equivalent of the highway network for on-road transportation. What we found is that to also make this viable, we need to have sort of recurring volume, right? So going back to the point around we don't know what the perfect good is. We do know a certain set of traits that would make this viable. So we need recurring volume, typically higher value, and making sure that we're moving goods that are practical for this, means of transportation. The other thing is the waterfront, and I think Leslie made this point, right? A lot of people don't know that they have access to waterfront. And many of the panelists have talked about sort of the complex history of the waterfront in New York City. And today that looks like a lot of a mix of ownership and permitting and processes and designs to make these sites come online to enable Blue Highways. And so if there's a way to not reinvent the wheel every time that we want to gain access to the waterfront, that is another way to enable Blue Highways. These learnings have come from pilots that we've been working on. And so pilots have been really critical to create sort of an operating playbook so that once we're able to bolster up this network, we have a healthy market or demand for Blue Highways. One example, and I've had the fortune to work with Paul and Leslie on connecting Hunts Point, for example, to Manhattan. That was a great exercise in figuring out sort of, where the sort of hurdles and pain points that we need to figure out. And just finding partners that are willing to take a lot of risk with us at the get-go and test out these things. So I think the future we don't know what the future looks like. Today, we're working with what we have, but we're working with what we have to figure out what we need for the future. And so today we have this sort of secondhand vessel. We're using renewable diesel. In the future, that could look like a more cleaner, purpose-built fleet. But what's important is sort of learning together across silos, across sectors, to make sure that we're building intentionally. Because to Jonathan's point previously, like we didn't arrive here because of like full intentional planning, but we need to be careful with what we do in the future. And that moment is here today.
Ilana, can you just quickly talk about one risk you took recently, which was you invested in a refrigerated container for the deck of your vessel and how that might serve the wholesale food distribution industry?
Yes, certainly. So speaking of the Hunts Point efforts, we recently, well, with the support of Red Hook Container Terminals, thank you to Mike Simonis and the team, we had a reefer container loaded onto the deck of our vessel that could handle refrigerated goods, so maintaining cold chain. And if we're going to service, markets like Hunts Point, we have the produce market, the fish market, and others, we need to be thinking about cold chain. And so that was not something that we had initially conceived as part of, our model, but that's the beauty of these pilots. We're learning and we're realizing what do our potential users really need, and that was a big barrier to bringing certain users on. So we had that container on our vessel, and we're able to load goods on, quickly maneuver it into the reefer container, and quickly maintain temperature. So we were able to maintain 34 to 35 degrees on our vessel and make a 30 or so minute trip down from Hunts Point to Midtown, which, was maybe half the time it took to do that on the road. So that was a great demonstration.
Wow, sounds like a great successful pilot.
Yes.
So if I could just jump in on some of the infrastructure that we're really focused on that is playing with what Alana and the U.S. Coastal Team have mentioned, as well as Leslie and Paul up at Hunts Point. Right now, EDC kind of has a focus on behalf of the city on three different pieces of major infrastructure. One last year, working with the administration, we followed through on the Hunts Point Vision Plan with the removal of the Vernon C. Bain Correctional Facility barge. That opened up a direct waterfront space that is more than 6 acres immediately adjacent to the new Fulton Fish Market. Over the coming years, that site is being remediated as the Greater Peninsula was the site of manufactured gas plants, and so a very iterative process of restoring the underlying land there. But in parallel with that, essentially ensuring that the soil is good, and then opening up that southern waterfront edge of the Hunts Point market sort of peninsula there. In the meantime, parties like U.S. Coastal as well as ConAg, who is a partner of the fish market, are really kind of the cutting edge forces here, beginning the process of actively moving goods onto the water without yet having some of that formal infrastructure having been built. So first it's a question of space, then it's a question of infrastructure. Hunts Point, obviously, an incredibly important node where a large percentage of the city's consumable goods come and go out of. And then Alana also mentioned the support and partnership down at the Red Hook Container Terminal, which is within the greater Brooklyn Marine Terminal site that EDC has been working with the city and local stakeholders on advancing major reinvestments. So I'm curious to hear, Alana, it sounds like that cold storage container was lifted with one of the cranes by the local longshoreman and the operator, Mike Stamatis of Red Hook Container Terminal. Later this year, we're actually investing in a brand new additional crane there. And the greater Brooklyn Marine Terminal premise has been a real kind of incubator space, providing some of that docking and kind of startup space for companies like U.S. Coastal and others. And then on the other side of the river, kind of breaking into one of the hardest, kind of most land constrained places that there is in the country, with the density that there is in Manhattan. We have underway an effort to essentially append additional marine infrastructure to accommodate vessels like U.S. Coastal's Blue Highway 1 at Pier 6, which is the location of the downtown Manhattan heliport. And so creating an opportunity while working in sync with the emerging electric vertical takeoff aviation operations, being able to have microfreight arrive by water, landing directly onto this new kind of spud barge infrastructure. We're well into the permitting process there and hoping that by the end of next year, that infrastructure will be up and running and ready for parties like U.S. Coastal to be able to bring micro freight into Lower Manhattan. But there's so many different ways and things that fall underneath this Blue Highway model. There's the micro freight, there's containerization, which is moving containers. We actually have an RFEI on the street right now soliciting proposals on moving containers full of food from the Brooklyn Marine Terminal or from Jersey Marine Terminals, shipping containers directly up to Hunts Point, and then being able to send empty containers back, thereby avoiding bridge crossings, avoiding a lot of vehicle miles traveled there. And then the last kind of big category, microfreight, containerization, and then aggregates, and that's or bulk materials, and that's something that the party ConAg up at Hunts Point is actively involved in. There's a lot of construction industry up in the Hunts Point Peninsula, and by way of bringing in bulk materials by water, that means they're not coming in through the constrained roads up there, and so you're basically cutting in half the number of vehicle trips coming and going into communities.
Brad, you feel like you got something to say?
Sure, yeah, no, there's so much meat and potatoes here that we're getting into, which I love. Um, one thing that's really important is as much as everything we've heard about is really important to building out the long-term vision for and reality of Blue Highways. I do think, again, it's really important that we have the full ecosystem in play because the biggest thing I've found when I was working with Schooner Apollonia and now as I'm working with Hudson Shipping Companies, you just have to do something. So Alana was talking about pilots. The thing is, some of these pilots in some of the locations where RFEIs go out, it takes years to manifest that into some kind of reality, and I understand why. But to the extent that we have the ability to just make things happen and have small scale operators who have a burn rate where they can keep surviving in a scrappy way, and really do a true pilot that's not all about years of lead up, but just says, okay, it's almost like offering a prize. Who can find a way within the next 6 months to move X from this place to this place and make that happen and then build out the infrastructure around that once you get a reality moving? Because what I've certainly found is Blue Highways, as we all know, is something we know about, but it's not necessarily something that the average person in New York City is thinking about every day, about these background systems. Um, but if we can find a way to get more people seeing it and thinking, oh, I just read a story about X moving. So when we were with Schooner Apollonia, we were moving lumber around the harbor and malted barley that went to breweries. And, that was a regional system, but also there were intra-harbor stops being made. And once people realized that this was an option, because it's not the way that people think about moving their goods because of the last 50, 60 years of what the norm is. Once you break through that, then people start to think, huh, is this viable for my particular supply chain? Is there a way that I can reach my customers effectively and efficiently with this boat cargo bike combo? Um, so the big thing from my perspective is you have to do it and you have to allow things to just start happening. And then that kicks off the ecosystem. And once you have that going, you see where the infrastructure is needed.
No, this is really great. And that actually kind of leads right into we've been talking through a lot of the questions that were pre-drafted. So those in the audience know that this is going perfectly. Um, a question, I'll throw this over to Jonathan maybe. Can you talk about the lack of awareness in career pathways have impacted the industry? And how do we use this moment to bring broader awareness?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'd like to talk about lack of awareness in two valences because I think lack of awareness of career trajectories, which some good and worthy efforts like the New York Harbor School, the Billion Oyster Project, and indeed the work that we do here, along with entities like SUNY Maritime, have made some inroads in making maritime more visible. The other piece of this is that maritime as an industry has been I think there's two parts to this. One is that it's been out of sight, out of mind because of what Brad has now coined the great atrophy, which I quite like. Um, the fact that the port infrastructure has stopped being at the river's edge, right? Again, going back to this kind of notion of Manhattan Island ringed with shipping piers such that it looks like a porcupine. When that was true, it wasn't an accessible waterfront, but everybody had somebody in the business, whether they were a longshoreman or an agent or a ship owner or whatever it was, a dock builder. So everyone was connected to the industry in one way or another. New York was a maritime town and everybody knew it. And now New York is a maritime town and almost nobody knows it. And I think that has a lot of knock-on effects. I think the other thing I would say about this is that maritime as an industry has been, globally not really interested in getting visibility. that because visibility drives regulation, regulation drives cost. And so I think in a classic business sense, they've sort of kept their heads down. But the aggregate of the invisibility and the industry's sort of shyness, if you will, about the public sphere does have a negative effect in terms of public awareness and political awareness. And so political awareness shows up in terms of how easy is it to get governmental organizations that control purse strings, whether that's the city council or the US Congress, to pay attention to infrastructure that's necessary to make these good initiatives work, or whether it is a kid growing up in New York City seeing among the potential paths a career as a longshoreman or as a merchant seaman or working in the business of shipping or whatever it is. And so I think invisibility has served various moments that sort of kept the regulators away, kept the safety monitors away in the interest of profit. But it now has a really negative impact in that, I mean, at the Seaport Museum, we welcome lots of people here, and an astonishing number of people are either unaware entirely that New York was and is a port, or they're aware of it only in some sort of notional way that oh yeah, there used to be a lot of ships here. That must have been so beautiful kind of approach, which I think that is a failure of visibility and education that has these knock-on effects, both in terms of funding the infrastructure, finding the political will to take action. I mean, a little bit what Leslie was talking about in the South Bronx. So, like, how do these things happen if people don't actually know that this is an environment that is, and this is where I'll restate this, a part of the public realm, right? This is the sixth borough of New York City. And it deserves its own commissioner. It deserves its own community board. It deserves a level of attention from the public, which will slow some things down, but it will also create a seat at the table for the people of New York City. And ultimately, that's how the public realm serves the people. And that public realm can absolutely be supply chain. It can be getting you green vegetables and fresh fish and whatever else it is. Visibility, I think, is part of the problem and part of the solution.
If I could just jump onto the visibility element, I agree with much of what Jonathan's framed up about sort of it being a hidden space. But I do think that the past 5, 6 years, we've been increasingly in a time where folks are living their own lives and getting whacked by the realities of global supply chains, starting with COVID, then moving into energy realities today, if we're talking about the Strait of Hormuz and what's going on with maritime supply chains. And then if you are a New Yorker in New York City right now, I think the journey of offshore wind has been something that even if you've got your head in the sand, you looking up at the horizon in New York City, you will see the largest crane that has ever existed in the United States operating in South Brooklyn right now as a part of the load in and load out of offshore wind related components. And then the opener here of the Sail 250 event that's going to be coming in several days. There has been a cavalcade of folks working to accommodate the 100 or so vessels, both smaller tall ships, Class A tall ships, and naval ships from around the world coming into New York City. But I think, right now is a unique moment of maritime being in everybody's face, from the good to the bad to all sorts of realities. And there's an opportunity here to ride the wave and really lean back into the fact that we are uniquely positioned in New York Harbor with institutions of higher ed as well as primary school that in many ways are unprecedented compared to much of the nation, where you've got SUNY Maritime and Merchant Marine Academy waving across the Long Island Sound from each other, the north end of the city and in Nassau County. Major Coast Guard installations in New York City. A number of our CUNY campuses having been converted over time from Coast Guard facilities, but still offering a AA or a BA in maritime education. But now's the time, and we have the resources here to lean into this. And even going back to Hurricane Sandy, I mean, the water was everywhere, and there's a lot of work to be done on the waterfront.
Wow, what a great, eloquent kind of bow on top to there. We've kind of gone back, we've gone forward, we've gone up, we've gone down. I think we'll kind of jump to our final lightning round question here, end on a positive note. If we get this right, how will daily life in New York feel different? Let's just popcorn real fast. Paul, you want to go first?
Decongested streets, ideally, both in receiver communities and in the last mile communities where these deliveries originate. Thank you, Alana.
Whose streets, our streets, whose harbor, our harbor. Like if New Yorkers feel like they own it, that's success.
Great chant.
Better public health and seeing the water as a way of healing, of having recreation and activity, free things to do, a mode of transportation, and usage of the water properly.
Dollars and cents, the break-even point where people are actually choosing to put things on the water because it ends up being cheaper than moving it on the roads.
Of course, the EDC guy says that.
I'll jump on that and say yes, I hope that happens as well, and that it does so in a way that it almost happens quietly, as such as the waterfront is today to many people. It happens quietly, but you start to see the effects on our communities, right? Cleaner air, more breathing room on our streets and curbs, and things are just moving more sustainably.
I would say every New Yorker knows a mariner. That's the future that I envision.
Wow, these were all such great answers. What a fun way to end a really insightful panel, really, really helpful. We have a couple minutes here at the end to go over questions. I know, Brad, you've been answering them as it's been going on, so thank you for taking the lead on that. But I do see an interesting one here. How will Port Jersey and Jersey City, New Jersey be involved in the Blue Highways program? Will we see more vessel traffic from Jersey City to the rest of New York City? Anybody have an answer to that?
Go for it, Brad.
I was gonna say Max probably knows more about this than anyone, but I imagine you would mention ro-ro connections between the port and New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's strong opportunities for roll on, roll off. There's been a number of companies that have been exploring that concept out of the Bayonne Peninsula. I think the RFEI that we have on the street related to the BMT to Hunts Point container barge operation, a logical sort of extension of that operation would be the terminals over in Jersey being a part of that loop. And then even today, EDC has been operating the Cross Harbor barge with our operator, Red Hook Container Terminal, to their facility over in Newark. So Jersey is integral to this vision, just given that that's where 95% of containers are when it comes to the port of New York and New Jersey. While we've got a huge consumer base east of the Hudson, but the goal here is strengthening those lines of connection, and whether that's coming out of Bayonne, Elizabeth, Newark, that's all part of it.
I think you also, have to look at commodity by commodity. What are the most viable candidates to end up on the water into New York? I would keep an eye on European beer.
Just to throw another kind of historical component in this, at the peak of the harbor's operations, there were more than 500 tugboats operating in New York Harbor, registered in New York Harbor. And now the number is a lot smaller, and partly that's because horsepower is grown, but it's also because there are fewer nodes to connect to. And so if we think about this from a vision standpoint, it's not bringing back the coal-fired steam tugboats of the 19th century, but it is looking forward to a sustainable model, possibly electric intermodal transportation system that within living memory still existed and can still exist again. And what does that do? It makes the ability to drive through the New York metropolitan area on your way to your family's vacation take less than 4 hours, right? It's like it's got immediate quality of life benefits, not to mention the respiratory illnesses that are suffered by people who live next to the highways and so on. So like think 19th century tugboat busyness, but with more nodes and more propulsion.
And to that point on nodes, like keeping an eye on sort of the smaller ports, right, or complementary ports. So maybe not necessarily linking directly to Port of Jersey, to New York City, right, but maybe they're adjacent sort of smaller ports. And to Brad's point, roll on, roll off activity where goods may come in through your traditional means, coming in through your major ports, but then they're shunted to these smaller ports and then brought into New York City. So that's definitely that could also be part of the equation.
Love that. Well, we are kind of at time here, so I don't know that we'll go through another question. But I do see a question in here about contact information for the panelists. So panelists, if you're open to it, feel free to drop your contact info into the chat so that if anybody has a follow-up, they can reach out to you directly. Otherwise, thank you all to our wonderful panelists for their excellent insights and hilarious terminology today. It's been a wonderful, wonderful panel, and thank you to everybody who joined us in the audience. This has been a wonderful webinar. And then just throwing it out there that if you are ready to brace the heat on Friday, we know it's going to be a big heat wave, but it is also going to be the kickoff of Sail 250 that's been mentioned a couple of times. So we hope to see you down at the seaport for the Class B tall ship parade that will be happening on Friday. Otherwise, of course, Waterfront Alliance, I'm Director of Comms, I have to plug it. City of Water Day is coming up. July 23rd is the kickoff cardboard kayak race to celebrate and get excited. And then City of Water Day itself will happen on July 25th. That's a Saturday. Check out the website to find an on water or near water activity near you. So thank you again to our panelists and everyone for attending, and hope to see you out on the water.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.